Welcome to This Week in Heresy, episode 33, Does God Hate Shrimp? Recorded live at PantheaCon 2015 with our guest, Joe Decker. Hi, Joe. Welcome to This Week in Heresy.
Hey, how are you doing?
Good. Could you introduce yourself and tell people a little about who you are and what you do?
Sure. My name is Joe Decker, and by day, I'm a nature photographer specializing in polar stuff these days, but I'm probably better known as the co-creator of God Hates Shrimp, which was a 15-minute joke that started in 2004 that hasn't died yet.
Awesome. So, okay, what was the joke?
Well, we have to go back. It was very early 2004, and I don't remember off the top of my head whether it was just before or just after the San Francisco marriage revolution, where Gavin Newsom decided one Valentine's Day, appropriate to to our recording, that to start marrying couples, and conveniently starting to do so on a Friday, so the judicial system would have a few days that it couldn't react, and it was quite a kick in the social thing. But about that time, I had talked to a lot of people about marriage equality, and had run into a lot of really bad arguments. And so I'm sitting reading Yahoo News one day, and I see a photograph which is some Ku Klux Klan protesters. They kind of look like Westboro Baptist protesters, but it was actually the Klan. They were in Oklahoma City, and they were holding up all of these very ugly signs. But the one nearest the camera said, God hates sodomites, Leviticus something, something, something. And I was like, I could totally Photoshop that. I have Photoshop, and I know how to use it. And it just, like, the ridiculousness of the argument seemed pretty apparent to me at the time. And so I dug that up and changed a couple numbers. And I think part of the reason that the word shrimp ended up in God Hates Shrimp was that, you know, I didn't have to change the S at the beginning of this. But I also came to the conclusion that shrimp is just a funny word, you know, pickle. It's a funny word, shrimp. Yeah.
Well, there's the whole shellfish thing in Leviticus too.
And that's clearly what was on that. The argument was there. So God hates shrimp, and Leviticus just had to change the numbers. In fact, I had to change the verse. I couldn't. You'd have to remind me.
Yeah, if I'm remembering correctly.
Yeah, and so I put up. So I threw up the JPEG on my live journal and went, ha ha ha. Maybe one or two people will comment on this and get a laugh, and that's great. And it seemed to be very popular on my live journal, and I didn't get up until the next morning when Mary, my friend Mary, who I, in fact, at the time, one of my sweeties, Mary, gets a hold of me and says, Joe, I don't think you know my friend Ryland. He's down in Texas, and he got a hold of me and said he liked your Photoshop and wanted to do a website. I'm like, okay, I could do a website. And so I met Ryland, not in person, but, online. We said, let's do a website. And we spent like 2 or 3 days, throwing something together, and had a lot of fun with it. And said, well, that'll be funny for, 2-3 hours at least, and put it up. And in fact, I think it was right before the San Francisco thing, because it petered along mostly in my friends list for about a week. And then all of a sudden, it seemed like it was everywhere. Instapundit, The Stranger, which is the alternative weekly in Seattle, put the URL for it on the cover in place of their own URL in an issue on same-sex marriage. And there was like this 10 minutes of fame where just, sitting watching the Google results changing minute to minute with that. And so that petered out for over, months and stuff, but it was kind of exciting. I figured I had my 15 minutes of fame and stuff, but the site never seemed to drop interest. Kept on getting emails. Goes through waves. A couple years after that, I think around between 2007 and 9. And remember, the site was in 2004. There was about a year where morning radio shows or radio talk shows of different sorts decided that I'd be a fun guest. And usually that was played a little tongue-in-cheek at first, like they'd have me pretend that this was my hating shellfish was actually my religious belief, and that was kind of fun. I think it was a show in Maryland that probably ended that streak in part by surprising me halfway through the interview by putting Shirley Phelps Roper on another line.
Oh no! I think I remember that. Actually,
yeah,
I remember hearing that.
It got a little hairy there for a little bit, but eventually she called me a dumbass and hung up.
That's right. I remember.
And
that one.
I actually think that were I to have a headstone, dumbass Shirley Phelps Roper would be. Would be my happiest epitaph.
Well, you kind of made it then, because that's how I'm gauging my success.
Hey, exactly.
Like once I start really getting the hate mail, it's gonna be awesome, because then I know it's being listened to everywhere. I've only gotten one though, and it was really lame. It just said I was going to hell, and I was like, come on! If you're gonna send me hate mail, at least be creative about it.
I had someone tell me I was a threat to the human race.
Seriously?
Yeah, and they misspelled threat. That was pretty good. About 2 years ago, someone decided that we needed a Facebook group. There's now 5,000 people in the Facebook group.
I'm on it.
There's a lot of stupid humor on it, and some of it, but I think mostly most of the folks on there have a pretty good sense of trying to make light out of sort of painfully oppressive and hateful things that are in our society. And I think that humor is a way of coping with them rather than engaging, often counterproductively. So I think that's probably the purpose it serves. At least, I like to have something to something to tell myself that it's more than a 10-year-old joke at this point.
Well, I think it's inspired a lot of other people to use humor in order to deal with groups like Westboro Baptist Church, because there's one guy that just is really cheery and gives cookies to them and just hands them cookies and is like, I love you. God loves you. Have a cookie.
There are the other groups who hold basically donation drives for every minute that they protest something. They'll donate towards a good cause. I like that.
In fact, there was a whole town that did it for a neo-Nazi march that I read about earlier,
which is beautiful. And I'm certainly not the first or the last to try and use humor for this. I don't remember whether, do you know Charlie who did God Hates Figs?
That sounds vaguely familiar.
Yeah, I think that was Charlie Enders, who you might know from IO9 or something like that. I could be mistaken, but we're certainly not the only force out there in parody. But
right.
But it's nice to be part of an important tradition, I think. So
it's now, 2015, so it's been around for quite a while now.
Yeah, 11 years.
11 years.
Yeah, in fact, this is the 11th anniversary, more or less. I mean, plus or minus a couple days.
Well, happy anniversary.
Yeah.
Do you still get the mail?
Yeah. Yeah, not as much, but people find the Facebook group more often. And I think people have heard it more. So it's less shocking to people than it was at first, but we still occasionally occasionally get people who think it's going to be helpful to argue, and very occasionally the delightful person who still thinks that doesn't get that it's an act of parody, especially on the website. The Facebook group, it's a little harder to miss. But so yeah, I would say if it has petered out in the last 2 years, and I kind of think that's a sign we're winning. But it still surprises me that it's got a lot more legs than anyone, I think, could have rationally expected.
Well, because of that, say, do people make assumptions about your own spiritual path?
Yeah, they do. And it's hard to say exactly what. Usually they assume that I'm a bleeding edge, hating everything atheist. And we certainly have some of those on God Hate Shrimp, and not being a capital B believer has been part of my life for a long time. But I also bring a lot of what I would call pagan thinking into my spirituality. And exactly what I mean by that is sort of difficult to summarize in a thumbnail. So yeah, people get a little surprised by that. And I think and Ryland found that as well. In fact, I'm not actually 100% sure I knew his true spiritual path, which is an interesting thing for someone you work with for several years.
Right.
He passed away a few years ago, so
Sorry to hear that.
But I like to think that he's enjoying the continuing efforts of his work and a lot of his other work, like the church sign generator. I would strongly recommend if you need your message to appear as if on a church signboard. Boy, does he have the site for you!
Awesome. I've seen that, and I've actually seen quite a few people use that. And you know, I will say that your site is quite popular in seminary.
Is it?
It is. Well, what's really funny is I was in the dining hall one afternoon, and I don't remember exactly when it was in my seminary years, but I think towards the beginning, I think. But I was in there, and somebody's like, "Oh yeah, you know this site God Hate Shrimp," and I'm like, "Hey, I know the person who made that." They're like, "No way!" And I was like, "Yeah, way!" And so I had a little bit of like, "Oh, that's so cool. Yay." But you know, a lot of people really like, at least in the seminary context, they really like the whole the humor of it.
Yeah.
And you know, especially like for those of us who, you know, are taking Old Testament, it's like you know, we have a good chuckle with it. And it's really interesting to see that, and then how we deal with, you know, we kind of deal with our seminary life and learning the Bible by a lot of that kind of same humor.
Oh, I would imagine. I would imagine. The it's interesting. I would guess from that reaction that you're telling me about, that people got that I was not presuming that this as parody, this God Hate Shrimp is an argument, but it's not a very strong argument. Like, I wouldn't use it to convince you.
And I think that's what people assume. You know, you know, you're not converting the people I knew in seminary for the most part. But you know, they thought it was really brilliant satire, and it was a brilliant interpretation of those texts.
It's right, and it's a parody of a bad argument. As a bad argument. I like to think that I learned a few things along the way, but about better arguments, but I don't really claim to have a deep understanding of the historical background. I haven't picked up the appropriate background in ancient Greek that would be required for some of the digging through, I mean, because my understanding, and you're the expert here, not me, is that there are in some people's minds some real linguistic issues that remain open questions about what some of those verses mean, even before you get to questions of context, of where they're appearing and with what meaning and in what world, right? Before that, you have, what does this word even mean? And
And it means something different to us now in the modern world than it ever did in the ancient world. You know, the ancient world had different associations, different meanings to, well, at least for the Old Testament, it would be Hebrew. So Leviticus would have been in Hebrew.
Right.
But, you know, I know a bit of enough Greek to be dangerous. But,
right. And that's where Romans and Corinthians and what have you come in.
But it's the same idea because, you know, what we think about as homosexuality and what is wrong, like, you know, what people think is a verse condemning that.
Yeah.
Doesn't necessarily mean what they think it means, you know?
And again, my vague recollection is that one of the Greek terms, there's even an argument about whether the word refers to something that would relate to even anything in the general vicinity of homosexuality.
Right.
Rather than, I don't know. I don't pretend to know. It is interesting in trying to point people towards better resources when they try and come and have an argument. But seriously, if you want a good theological argument, probably the best place to start is not a humor site on the web.
Right. Although, you know, some of the best theologians have been very funny.
Oh, that doesn't surprise me at all.
Yeah. I mean, I've had professors and, you know, monks, nuns. You just look at them and you just like, what did you just, you know?
Well, it says, this might seem a strange analogy, but a lot of spiritual work deals with very serious life questions and also often life events. And in a similar way, a lot of my friends in the emergency response community who are dealing with life at a very fundamental level, have wicked, heretical senses of humor. Yeah.
Well, it's a way to process it. And I think it's not really different from our own needs to process difficult situations with weird humor.
Yeah.
But, you know, for people in those type of professions where they're dealing with death or birth or just life issues and trauma and things, you know, I think that's the only real way you can deal with it.
Yeah, and I think that humor, as you go into ministering people in the real world, probably, I would imagine that helps them as well, not just the people who are grappling with it in seminary, but in the real life. I sort of wish the world had a little more of a sense of humor sometimes.
We'll never underestimate the place of a well-placed raspberry. You know? There's some times where, you know, it's a really tense situation and, you know, you kind of need it's easier to change the mood than to shift to something else. You know?
I will keep that in mind.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we've done that in our Wiccan practice, and I've done that in circles where, you know, it's been really serious and people are thinking about really deep things. And then I'll say something funny right before the Eucharist, or I'll say something funny when breaking the bread, or, you know, fruit of the bee, you know, and that usually gets people laughing. So, you know, I think it's a way to kind of just let that out without having people letting more out seriously, like just kind of loosening up the atmosphere.
Yeah, and maybe pulling them out of something they're obsessing about and seeing. Yeah, there's some Buddhist ideas around that, around laughter there that might be interesting to think about in that context as well. Huh. Interesting.
Yeah. So, I know I've seen God Hate Shrimp come up a lot. I really have. You know, I've seen actually people with signs out there protesting, even Westboro. You know, I know we're talking a lot about Westboro, but, you know, they're easy targets.
And they were behind a lot of my, to the extent that there was actually a year or two where I forgot that the original protesters weren't Westboro Baptist because God Hates X is so associated with them. But yeah, we had a number of people who actually counter-protested with signs and sent us photos at different times of that. About a dozen of us made an attempt to pick them up 5 or 6 years no, maybe a little more than that, at the GLAAD Media Awards, and they missed the stop, so we never got to see them. But we had our big signs, and we were waiting, and
Awesome.
we went off and had dinner. We had a good time anyway. But
Do you think more people are doing those kind of protests than not? Like, because it just seems like people are just kind of like, and are just kind of more of like, we need to do something to protect the people that they're protesting against.
yeah, I think it really depends on the context. In a lot of ways, I feel like peak counter protest has already happened here in California, and a lot of areas where marriage equality is really not so much the issue of the day anymore. And I feel people are, I don't think that they've stopped caring or stopped making a difference, but it's but the issues and the divisiveness around it have softened a little bit. It feels more like a done deal, so people aren't treating it like an active war. And I think because there's less anger to kind of let go of, I think the humor quotient, I think people feel like, well, okay, I don't think they're thinking this consciously, but there's less of this humor as a response to discomfort.
Right. Do you think...
It's the wrong word, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you ever get people saying, oh, well, by people protesting, you're squashing other people's free speech?
I get a lot of... I've certainly heard a little bit of almost every response. I don't get a lot of that. I mean, I occasionally get people who think that I'm mocking any possible form of Christianity, and that wasn't the intent. I mean, early on, it was certainly my hope that a lot of Christian identified people would find the site funny, and hopefully we managed to cut that line. But it's a delicate thing. The one place where I did have an interesting oh shit moment was about a week and a half after we first put up the site, and like you're Googling yourself and seeing what links
Right.
there, like you
Checking
do.
the stats every 10 minutes. Yeah.
And I don't remember the name of the site, but I'm looking through, and I come up with a site that's linked here called Ask the Rabbi. And I'm like, because, and this is incredibly naive of me, there are, of course, people who take the Leviticus dietary restrictions seriously, and I thought it was clear from context that, so with some trepidation, I followed the link and go there, and it was a question and answer thing. And the question was like, Rabbi, I found this site, and it was kind of funny. And then I started thinking, wait, I don't eat shellfish. Maybe I should be a little more uncomfortable about it. And I honestly don't remember the exact phrasing. Again, it's been years, but the tone and the sort of brief response from the rabbi involved, and I wish I could remember who it was because it was great. It was just like, more or less, it was lighten up. It's not about us, and it's pretty funny.
Good rabbi.
It wasn't quite lighten up. It was a little kinder than that would sound, because and that made me feel good. But it is an interesting thing to watch out for when you're doing parody. You can be aiming one place, but you got to worry about where your shrapnel lies.
Because I mean, there's been some other parodies that I've seen, and it's, there's some that are well done, and then there's some that you're just kind of like, okay, so I get what you're trying to do, but it's not very funny, and it's kind of nasty or racist or, sexist or ... And
it's some of those things end up on our Facebook group. Honestly, we've certainly had to remove a number of things that we've caught, and honestly, I don't think we've done a completely professional job of moderating the group. in that regard. To one extent, it can be very difficult to draw a precise line.
Right.
But we now have, I think, 4 moderators, and all of them have my, if you think this needs to go, I will never criticize you for taking it down as their marching orders. 1 vote is enough to be off the island, and that's helped some. But it is a difficult line to walk, and I think that trying to do parody mindfully is a good thing. And it can be really hard, because if you find something funny, you are totally in that moment. Right. That's a very experiential thing. Is there a pattern to some of the problematic stuff you've seen in this kind of humor?
Well, I actually, I think I'm mostly thinking about the Charlie Hebdo stuff, where that, people shouldn't have gotten killed. That's, that's just a blanket thing.
Totally.
People shouldn't have to die because of what they write. However, my conflict around that was, I didn't think their stuff was very funny, and I think it was really crappy and really racist. And, I wasn't quite sure what to do with that, and I really had to sit and think for a while before I even wrote anything about it. Yeah,
and I feel like I'm still grappling with some of that. There's a couple of reasons. One is I don't know. First, yes, some of the stuff just, no. Yeah. It doesn't work for me. Let me be really clear about that. I don't know the history of the organization. I've seen 10 cartoons people have pulled out of what is probably 1,000 things they've done. I don't know to what degree that's, and that doesn't, even if they're rare, that they're problematic, and I have no reason to believe that that's the case.
Right.
That doesn't make them good.
Right.
But I think how you respond to that sometimes is this someone who's making a bunch of calls and occasionally gets it wrong, or is this someone, and I think you respond to that kind of problem differently depending on it, but it's still a problem.
Yeah.
So that's something I struggled a lot with, especially lacking a certain amount of current affairs context in France. I struggled a lot sort of dissecting the overlapping intersections of picking on people because of their religion and picking on people because of their race, which are very intertwined.
Yeah.
In that, and probably economic divisions as well. So I think it's a very difficult thing to pick apart, and which is not to say people should be shot, but
yeah, but it's, I think you're right. I think it's a fine line between making fun of something in a good humored way, and then being like, all Muslims are bad because of extremists, and it's just kind of like, really, you're going to go there, you're going to paint a whole group of people with the same brush because of some jerk-offs? It's like, painting all Christians as jerk-offs because of the Westboro Baptist Church.
Right. And I think one tool that we normally look at to identify humor that might be a little more appropriate versus not, one of the things we're looking at is it punching down or punching up?
Right.
But I think you could argue in some regards, especially when you have, on one hand, I think you could argue that in some situations, because intersectionality, you could make arguments about which way is up and which way is down. If you have, many people feel that very large organized religious bodies, not the religion itself, but the organizational infrastructure, are very large sources of power. And so hitting those is punching up. I've certainly made jokes about the Vatican.
Oh, right.
Yeah. I feel like that's punching up. But if at the same time I was picking on a group of people who, just to make up a theoretical example, who were both Catholic and of some class that was punching down, how do you start assessing that? And I'm just saying it's challenging.
Well, and the other thing too is one of the other arguments is like, well, free speech. And it's like, and I say this to a lot of people, free speech is all well and good. And you certainly can say whatever you want. But free speech also goes the other way, and it doesn't mean we can't tell you you're being a jerk.
Well, free speech can. Well, yes. First, you should definitely. There should always be the freedom to say, "I'm sorry, what you just said, that was really fucked up." Don't do that.
Right.
Yeah, I don't. I think. From a legal perspective, I certainly think that speech should be relatively free, but I think we need to really have a deep understanding that when we start saying negative things about oppressed classes of people, especially very small ones,
right?
That is small in terms of population,
right?
That the net effect of 95% of the population making jokes about making 95 jokes at one person out of 100 can be overwhelming and can actually cause quite a bit of harm.
Definitely.
And in a way that if those numbers were reversed, the actual psychological effect would be substantially different. And I think that's actually where the punching up versus punching down test of parity comes from.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's very difficult. And I think there's much more awareness with the internet about who's doing what. It's easier. I like to say, the internet is forever.
I am shocked to the degree which the internet is forever.
Absolutely. Yeah. And even with your site, you've seen it's still alive since 2004.
Oh yeah.
And the thing is that I think people are much more aware of the rest of humanity because of the internet. Like there's other people that exist outside of your hometown.
And that's been very powerful. I think that one of the great successes that we've had in terms of changing minds about lesbian and gay people in the United States over the last 10 or 15 years, which is a place where I think we can go to polling numbers and see very, very substantial changes. There's a lot of good evidence that is has been driven just by people knowing other people. And the internet has been a great way for people to get exposed to people who are very different than themselves. There's still a lot of barriers to that. People filter bubble on politics, and language is a huge divider in a lot of cases.
Right.
It would be lovely if I could as easily read a lot of what's being written in Arabic.
Right. Exactly.
That would be very interesting.
Yeah, there's many times where I wish I knew a few that had like several languages under my belt, because it's like I really want to know what it means when they tell it to me.
Yeah.
I need to hear their voice, what it means to them.
And that needs to be and I think it's very powerful when that's a single person to single person kind of connection rather than reading a news article or something like that. As important as that is, it's harder. Yeah, you can get translations of news articles. It's just not that easy to start making friendships with people who you share very little with in terms of language.
Yeah. And I was talking, I did an interview with P. Sufenus Various Lupus this week, actually. And he said that, we were talking about a similar thing. Like, he was saying that, you and I was saying as well that you really can't understand the other unless you are able to hear their story.
Yeah.
And, and I think we've been able to hear more of the personal stories of people. Like if you think about like the Arab Spring, right? You could see on Twitter, on Facebook, and all of those, you got to see the people, and then you instantly got to see people talking about why they're there, and what they're doing, and learning about why the people were throwing pots, and which was a very powerful, magical device, I should say.
I'm not sure I actually know that. Do you want to?
Well, basically, there's an ancient thing about throwing pots at. I'm probably murdering the whole thing. But the idea is that you are driving somebody away with these pots, and they were throwing them at the steps of the palace so that they would drive him away. And it was just like, that is wicked fascinating. And, if it was 20 years ago on the news, you just see the highlight reel, and you wouldn't find out these little details, and like you wouldn't be able to hear all the voices because a lot of that would be filtered out.
Yeah, and I think it has been. I think the internet has been a powerful force for people being exposed to people who are other in whatever way. It's also been a great way for smaller minority groups to find each other.
Yes.
Yeah. And I know a lot of people in different alternative sexuality communities. I've got one or two friends who have interests which are very unusual in particular. Mm-hmm. And the fact that they can find people who have a mutual interest, even if not in their state.
Right.
It's a very, very powerful. I mean, that's an extreme example.
Well, another example is the pagan community, the current neo-pagan community, because the internet really, and I've talked about this with a few people on This Week in RC. The internet really kind of made the pagan community what it is now, because, we wouldn't have been able to find each other and organize if it weren't for the internet. And pagans really latched onto that because, at first, it was kind of few and far between. It's like, oh my God, you're a witch. You live in my same town. Oh my God.
Yeah. And I think it's also very powerful and very interesting to me that in many ways the pagan community has, in addition to organizing as a bunch of individual faiths, also there is some greater overarching pagan community. Here we are at Pantheacon, and there is an enormous range of people who have very, very different beliefs sitting and finding common ground. I think that's very powerful.
It's amazing. And, and it keeps getting more diverse every year.
Oh, I know.
Which is awesome. And, and a lot of the organization, a lot of the connection, I mean, a good chunk of that happens online through Twitter, even during the convention itself, even though there's a lot of FaceTime here.
Yeah.
A lot of that connection happens online.
And would you know when Pantheacon started? Let me just guess. It was after the internet.
Yeah, it was before. Well, it was about 21 years ago, something like that. 21. Thank you.
Not really a surprise then. I mean, that's that's starting to be where there was a critical mass of people who could start connecting with each other without having to be standing next to each other.
Yeah.
And that's brilliant.
Yeah. And I think, making us more aware, to bring it back to free speech and parody and all, making us more aware of the other makes us think of, I think has been really starting to make people think about what they're saying, how they're saying it. Because, I think we're seeing kind of this evolution of thought. And, it's still been kind of Wild Westy on the internet. And, you've got your trolls, you've got Gamergate.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
That has been, I do some stuff at Wikipedia.
Right.
That's been quite a nightmare there. Yeah. And I have some
You're well
awareness.
aware.
Yes.
But I think it's improving because I think we're starting to get an expectation of what proper behavior on the internet is supposed to be.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of people aren't necessarily subscribing to the rules yet. There's at least among thoughtful people some kind of, oh, wait, when we do this, this happens. So let's not do it that way. Let's do it this way.
Yeah. Or, let's be aware that, the people on the other end of your joke, your bad joke,
yeah,
your satire that's racist, or, any of that, the people on the other end of that are human beings.
Yeah, that I was just reading. I wish I could remember the context, but there was an article in something that I was reading today. Actually, I think it was in the New York Times about a woman who's was running a communications department for some company, and she made a stupid, somewhat racist tweet, and it was a stupid joke.
Right.
She's like, I got 100 followers. It was stupid. It was or so this article makes sound, and it became a giant thing. It became, a big thing, and part of me is like, yeah, well, you made that bed, you lie in it, but it also suggests some important questions about how we deal with the range of problematic behaviors, and where, do we treat someone who is from the Westboro Baptist Church and who is consistently doing something? Do we respond to that in a different way than do we do to someone who really shouldn't have had that third drink before they tweeted?
Well, it's, where do you find the compassion, right?
Yeah.
Where do you insert compassion for your fellow human beings?
Yeah, and it can be, there has to be balance there too, because a lot of times we're talking about compassion not only for the person who may have said something stupid, but the people that maybe they hurt by saying what they said.
Right.
And I don't think that's easy, and I don't think there are formulas for it. No. But I do think that you have to take into account that speech maybe should be free, but can do real harm to people. We see queer teen suicides.
Yep.
And much of what we're seeing there is people killing themselves because of speech.
Yep.
And so the idea that words can't hurt is crazy.
Yeah.
So we have to find a way to balance that, and education and compassion is our steps towards that, but it's hard.
And I think, a collective, I don't want to say collective unconscious, but a collective consciousness about as a human race. I've talked about it before as saying that, we're kind of going through our bratty teenager phase as a human race. We're not like, I'm going to say everything I want. And that, we're evolving, and we're still trying to figure it out. And we're kind of in that stage where we're like, what does this mean? What does that mean?
Yeah.
And so I think we're starting to get towards the other side of that. We're kind of like towards the halfway point, maybe. So I think, I think we'll get it eventually.
We've certainly come a ways, and there's certainly, Gamergate has certainly taught me we have a long way to go too.
Well, yeah, but I think eventually we'll get to a point where, doing that sort of thing like the Gamergate folks did, the doxing and all of that, where we'll get to that as a society, it'll be collectively bad. Like right now, whereas, like right now, gay marriage has now become, oh, that's not so bad. That's a fine thing. Let's all get married.
Yeah, move on.
Yeah, it's time to move on.
Yeah.
I think eventually we'll have that sort of societal rule. That
I think that's right. That's right, and I think that the bratty teenager phase is a great way of expressing that. I'm going to steal that.
Absolutely. So we're just about out of time.
Okay.
So I will have a link to God Hates Shrimp on the show notes.
And I will be sure to let the Facebook group know about this week in heresy and
Absolutely.
And your nitro burning heresy Sunday.
Awesome. He did that because of the microphone, I swear.
It's necessary. I'll see if maybe we can even do a little sound clip for you.
Absolutely.
Nitro burning heresy.
Like a clip of it and have it open up my website or something.
I would be glad. I would be honored to do that for you.
Excellent.
I know 30 years of imitating drag race announcers had to have a purpose in life, and now I found it.
There you go. So if people wanted to contact you to ask you questions,
sure. Probably the simplest way to reach me is through the contact me page on my photo website.
Okay.
So if you go to joedecker.net, joedecker.net, there's a contact me page, and it's a little forum, and you can type some stuff in.
Awesome.
And I'll be happy to like email back or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And
we'll definitely have that in the show notes.
Yeah,
as well. And you should buy his pictures because they're really awesome.
Oh, thank you. And I think there's not currently a live contact thing on GodHatesShrimp.com. Otherwise,
Okay.
I'd suggest that. And you can also look for me and a bunch of other crazy people on the God Hates Shrimp Perrin official group. Perrin, I'll give you a link. Facebook group.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
we could do that.
But drop me a line. Be happy to talk more.
Excellent. Well, thank you
so
for coming on.
Oh, thank you for having me. This was great.
Thank you to the studio audience. I'd like to thank Joe for joining us this week. As always, if you have comments, questions, or would like to read the show notes, you can go to thisweekinheresy.com. You can support This Week in Heresy by subscribing to the show via iTunes or the Stitcher app, following us on Twitter at TWIH Podcast, or financially through Patreon. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you next time.